So we have a little time for questions. Since I have these lights shining in my eye, I'm just going to have to point at things that look dimly like hands because I'm not going to be able to read a face or attach it to a name. An excuse also for my oncoming senility. So feel free to. Oh, we have microphones in the aisles? Terrific. So there's microphones here and there's a microphone there. Come on, don't be shy. This is your chance.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. My name is Stanley Fader. I'm from the MIT class of 1966, and I'd like to offer an observation and a request for future research. My observation is based on my spending 21 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Intelligence Council. I was a research political scientist and political analyst. And I tried to bring in the best of the analytic techniques that the academic community was producing. I tried to bring them into the CIA, to the Directorate of Intelligence. And as a political analyst, we tried to present good analyses to policymakers. And we ran into barriers. And I think the barriers are cultural, social, psychological, and maybe intellectual, and ideological. But what I found is that analysts within the Directorate of Intelligence had a certain way of thinking. Most of them, actually I should say too, that my data is about 18 years old. So, but beyond that, analysts have a certain way of thinking. They were hired mostly and trained to be really good writers and writing for policymakers. So they were resistant to systematic methods of analysis. And we found with policymakers, unless you got them at a time actually before a problem emerged, they were not opened to new ways of thinking about the policies that they were implementing. Some call this a problem of stating truth to power. Power often doesn't want to hear the truth, particularly if they're on a policy path. So I would like to see more research done on how the findings, the useful findings of the academic community can be conveyed and implemented in analytic groups within the government. And secondly, how do you present these findings to policymakers, most of, or many of whom are blinded by ideology? And that's my suggestion.
Thank you. So I know that some people in our group have had some interactions with people in the Intel community and the policy community. Do you have a vignette that you'd like to share about the moment when you saw the light go on, or the moment when you were sure that you didn't see it go on?
So I think this is something I can't actually speak to. I can never tell when the light's going on for other people. Sometimes they look half asleep and then manage to repeat exactly what I said word for word. And I'm like, you know my argument better than I do. And sometimes they seem to hang on every word and then do exactly the opposite of what I thought was a good idea. So I will say that I think there's a real strength of MIT's current attempts and current focus of the department is to try to incentivize individual scholars to do this type of work more than happens in some other political science departments around the country. I say this because in many departments, if I were a young professor, I would be told under no uncertain terms that I should never go to Washington, D.C. and talk about any of the things I just told you about here. I talk about them a little differently while in D.C. Less jokes about methods textbooks. But still, I think actually your comment sparked for me a question, which is we really don't have as much systematic evidence on what makes our presentations to policymakers successful as we do on a whole host of other political questions that we ask. Now, there is actually some research happening on this in political science, and especially at MIT. So we had a postdoc who was here last year who has worked on precisely the question of what do policymakers want out of academic research. My reaction to this was I'm not actually sure that policymakers know what they should be getting out of research. It's like how, my kid wants to eat mac and cheese and Tootsie Rolls for every meal, but he actually needs some nutrients at some point. Nevertheless, I think it is actually something that MIT could consider actually studying whether the ways that we're doing outreach to policy communities are effective as they could be, and if there are ways that they could be made more effective. So I think I would say I agree with the sentiment of the comment, and it sparked thoughts for more research, as every comment to an academic always does.
Yeah, we do have students who study learning in organizations. One of our students, Colin Jackson, wrote a dissertation on the military learning about counterinsurgency practice, and he teaches at the Naval War College now. And so we are putting people out in the field that analyze this idea about how organizations, and especially government organizations, intelligence organizations, learn. So in my own experience, and I just reviewed this last summer 2 internal documents for USASOC, United States Special Operations Command, basically the Green Berets. And so they are producing their documents. They are hiring people like me to comment on them. But there are standard operating procedures, and you're right, there's ideology, especially in military organizations. But in those cases, it really takes a crisis to learn, to shock these organizations out. So I'm curious, you were there for 21 years, whether you would have seen changes after crises that you saw. So there are times these organizations will shake up their assumptions that underlie their ideologies and try to change their standard operating procedures, but it's sort of rare with these big organizations like that. So what we need to do is look at how they change during the crisis periods and see whether the same types of ideas of learning that we observe there sometimes can be incorporated in non-crisis kinds of periods. Because I was on leave last year. I'm writing a book now called The Social Science Guide to the Iraq War with 2 of our students that actually served in Iraq. And I can tell you military people learned in about 2007 and 2008, there was a whole different mindset change. But it took 3 or 4 years for them to learn how to do things differently. Now, why did it take 3 or 4 years? Could this have been speeded up and lessons learned in 2007, 2008 be understood in 2004 or 2005? That's a good question, one that I'm looking at. So,
Go ahead.
It's a very good question. I think it gets to a very fundamental debate that I think is occurring in political science, in particular international security, which is how to bridge the gap, so to speak, and this whole Bridging the Gap project that Frank Gavin and some of our graduate students are involved in. I think there's a distinction between policy relevance and policy influence, and the mechanism I think you were describing was direct communication with policymakers. But I think there are a variety of ways in which all of us, I think, have had policy-relevant research that may have more indirect influence on U.S. government policy or international policy. So framing debates, as Barry said in his opening remarks, thinking about nuclear strategies of regional powers in different ways and what the different risks are. In my own limited experience, I've noticed that it's the permanent staffs and the civil servants and the bureaucracy that tends to be more attuned to the academic research. and one may have more avenues of influence there than, with principals or high-level policymakers. The other avenue, I think, is to serve in some limited way, whether it's with the periodic track 1.5 and 2s that I know Taylor and myself participate in various on various issues, or training some of our students or alumni who serve in government and having the policy relevant, rigorous background of an academic training, and then bringing that to the policy world as you yourself have done. So I think there are multiple ways, and the avenue that you described, which is direct influence of principals, I think is probably the hardest, but I think that we shouldn't overlook the other two ways that MIT has been particularly supportive of and very heavily involved in across not just international security policy, but health policy and a variety of other issues as well.
Yeah, I can second the observation about middle-level officials, as well as, I would say, military, even on the strategy staffs. I mean, people with 1 or 2 stars on their shoulders. I've had, I must have presented my work on restraint, which is really a significant critique of what we've been doing as a country for the last 15 or 20 years. I must have presented it, I don't know, 50, 60 times in the last 3 or 4 years. And my most receptive audiences are the people who've had to make this foreign policy work, right? The ones who've been in the trenches, right? Now, it doesn't get to the question of when the most senior people in the country, the political people, are committed to a policy. Once they're committed, it's quite hard to get them uncommitted. There's no doubt about that, right? So that particular moment is a very hard one to have some influence. The times when you can have some influence is when, to borrow from another field, Roger and I have been teaching civil wars, when policymakers get to the herding stalemate on their policies, which is what Roger was alluding to, which is a Civil War concept, then they're a bit more open to some advice about change. But what Vipin said, I think, is right. There's a bigger mission for us, and that's to put ideas into the echo chamber that frame the way people see issues. And the policy echo chamber is one that's filled with cacophonous voices, and many of them are motivated voices. And so it's not enough to launch a article or an argument into the echo chamber and hope that it keeps echoing. You have to find friends to shout your argument, and you have to shout it over and over again. And when you do that, you can have an effect. At least I've convinced myself once or twice that maybe I have had an effect. I think we are at your hour, is that correct? So I have to turn the podium back over to Andrea so she can tell you what happens next.
Well, many thanks to our panelists. And now we have a break. There's coffee and refreshments up in the hallway, and we will reconvene here at 11:30 and hear from some of our prominent alums. Thanks.